For exactly 100 years, the Royal Navy built the most powerful battleships on the planet. 157 capital ships, from the first iron hull in 1860 to the last rivet in 1946. Then, in 1960, they scrapped the final one and never built another. This video tells that whole story. Every British battleship that existed in chronological order with the exact combat records the Royal Navy filed. Hood, sunk in 8 minutes with 1,418 crewmen on board. Warspite, credited with 15 battle honours, more than any other ship in Royal Navy history. Prince of Wales, the first battleship in history ever sunk by aircraft in open water. And Vanguard, the last, the one that never fired her main guns at an enemy. I've been through the Admiralty archives, the Naval Historical Branch records, and the original plans for every class to reconstruct this history ship by ship. Almost everyone believes it was aircraft carriers that killed the British battleship. The Royal Navy's own archives tell a different story. The British battleship had been dying from the inside since the exact day it was invented. November 1859. France launches La Gloire, the world's first ocean-going ironclad, a wooden hull dressed in iron plates. In London, panic sets in. Every British ship of the line has just become obsolete in a single afternoon. The Admiralty writes that responding to France has become imperative, and I quote, without a moment's delay. The answer is called HMS Warrior. Launched in December of 1860, 420 feet long. A hull of solid iron. 4.5 inches of armor over 18 inches of teak. The cost, nearly £380,000, twice that of a wooden ship of the line. For the first time, the Royal Navy did not launch a ship of the line, but an armored frigate, a shielded warship designed to run down anything trying to flee across the channel. According to Admiralty records, the gunnery trials at Shoeburyness in 1861 confirmed that her armor was, and I quote, practically invulnerable to the ordnance at the time in use. But Warrior's problem was not the enemy. It was Warrior herself. Her 40 guns were still mounted broadside. To aim, you had to turn the entire ship. And in 1870, a British experiment called HMS Captain capsized in a storm off Finisterre. 500 men died. The Admiralty's conclusion was simple. Modern turrets and full masts could no longer coexist on the same warship. Therefore, in 1873, the Royal Navy commissioned something no one had ever seen before. HMS Devastation. 285 feet long, 0 masts, 2 twin turrets carrying 12-inch guns each. For the first time in history, an ocean-going British capital ship depended entirely on steam. No sails, just coal and iron. Warrior was moved to reserve that same year. The most advanced armored frigate in the world had become obsolete in 13 years. And somewhere in a Portsmouth workshop, someone was already sketching the weapon that in 20 years would make devastation obsolete too. 1889. The British Parliament approves the Naval Defence Act, and with it the two-power standard. By law, the Royal Navy must be at least as large as the next two navies combined. But the problem was that the Royal Navy itself knew its latest battleships were not up to the task. Atlantic seas came through their gun ports. Therefore, the response was the Royal Sovereign class. 8 ships launched between 1891 and 1892. What set them apart was raising the freeboard to almost 20 feet. The guns no longer sat in low turrets, but in barbettes, fixed pear-shaped platforms. In 1911, one of them, HMS Hood, served as the Royal Navy's first floating laboratory. She received the first anti-torpedo bulges in history. However, the race does not forgive. In 1893 came the Majestic class, the largest class of battleships ever built by any nation. 9 ships. The first to mount enclosed turrets with armored shields and 12-inch wire-wound guns firing smokeless powder. The Majestic design was so influential that Japan copied it line by line. The famous Mikasa, which would crush Russia at Tsushima in 1905, was a direct descendant of the British Majestic. Next came the King Edward VII class, 8 ships that sailors nicknamed Wobbly 8 because they rolled like corks in heavy seas. And yet it was these ships that opened British naval aviation. In May of 1912, according to service records, HMS Africa became the first British warship in history to launch an aeroplane from her deck. Therefore, when the Admiralty designed the Lord Nelson class in 1906, it already knew the era of mixed calibers was ending. Combat ranges were being pushed out to 6,000 yards, and the splashes of the smaller shells made accurate spotting impossible. The main turrets of Lord Nelson and Agamemnon were dismounted during construction and transferred to another ship being finished with maximum urgency. That other ship changed the definition of battleship forever. October 1904. Admiral John Fisher takes office as First Sea Lord. His private motto, "Speed is armor." In May of 1905, the Japanese fleet annihilates the Russian one at Tsushima at ranges over 6,000 yards. British observers note that the 12-inch guns showed decisive hitting power, while the 10-inch shells went unnoticed. Fisher's conclusion: the battleship of the future can only carry one caliber. All big gun. Therefore, on the 2nd of October 1905, at Portsmouth, they lay the keel of a ship whose name would become her category. HMS Dreadnought, launched 4 months later, commissioned in December of 1906, 14 months from the first rivet to the sea. No one in the world had ever built a capital ship that fast. The result was breathtaking. 10 12-inch guns in 5 twin turrets, and something no capital ship had ever carried: Parsons steam turbines. No reciprocating engines. Turbines. In October 1906 trials, she reached 21.6 knots. No battleship in the world could catch her. The moment she left the yard, every battleship in every navy, including the 157 the Royal Navy itself had in service, became obsolete. However, the ship's fame had one embarrassment. In 1910, a prankster convinced the Admiralty to receive so-called Abyssinian princes on board. They were welcomed with honors. The princes were his friends in disguise. Among them, a young Virginia Woolf in blackface. The Dreadnought hoax, the greatest public humiliation of the Royal Navy before the war. And Dreadnought's real combat record came from where no one expected it. On the 18th of March 1915, patrolling the Pentland Firth, she sighted the periscope of the German submarine SMU-29 and rammed it. According to Admiralty records, HMS Dreadnought is the only battleship ever confirmed in history to have sunk a submarine in combat. The ship that was supposed to revolutionize long-range gunnery wrote her record with the oldest technique in naval history, the ram. 1908. Germany launches her first dreadnought. In London, the public takes to the streets with the slogan, "We want 8, and we won't wait." The Admiralty had asked for 4. Parliament approved 8. Therefore, the Royal Navy raised its main caliber for the first time in 20 years. from 12 inches to 13.5. The Orion class, 4 ships, introduced the term the British press used from day one: super-dreadnoughts. And in HMS Thunderer, a prototype centralized gun director was mounted for the first time. A single officer from the foremast aimed every gun at once. The birth of modern fire control. Germany answered. The Royal Navy iterated again with the King George V class of 1911. And an important note here, because this name will return in this video 30 years from now. This King George V is not the 1939 ship that would help sink the Bismarck. She is her grandfather, and one of her 4 sisters, HMS Audacious, struck a German mine on the 27th of October, 1914. According to service records, the first British dreadnought ever lost in action. The Admiralty concealed the loss until November of 1918. Therefore, the next class, the Iron Duke, faced a new problem. The secondary guns were too small. The Admiralty's own studies were blunt. 4-inch guns were, and I quote, too weak and have too short a range to effectively combat torpedo boats with newer, more powerful torpedoes. Iron Duke mounted 12 6-inch guns. And something almost ignored in the history books, she was the first British battleship to carry anti-aircraft weapons. 2 3-inch guns fitted in 1914. Nobody knew yet if they would be useful. In 30 years, they would decide the fate of every fleet on the planet. 1912. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty at 38, makes the boldest decision of his pre-war career. Authorizing 15-inch guns before a single prototype existed. If they failed, the Royal Navy would have 5 unarmed battleships. If they worked, she would have the most powerful class on the planet. These 5 would not burn coal. Pure oil. Boilers running 100% on fuel oil. The gain was brutal. More range, more speed, more space for armor. But also a strategic vulnerability without precedent. Britain produced coal. Oil, almost none. Churchill secretly bought 51% of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the future BP, literally to fuel these 5 ships. The Royal Navy was entering the 20th century chained to the oil of the Middle East. The result justified every pound. 8 15-inch guns, 25 knots. The first fast battleships in history. At Jutland, in May of 1916, HMS Warspite took 15 heavy-caliber German hits in a single afternoon. Her rudder jammed. She circled twice under enemy fire. Every German gun was aimed at her. And she survived. Warspite would go on to serve at Narvik, Matapan, Crete, Sicily, D-Day, and Walcheren. According to official records, HMS Warspite is credited by the Royal Navy with 15 battle honors, more than any other ship in the entire history of the Royal Navy. The sailors gave her a name that became legend, the Grand Old Lady. However, not all of the sisters had that ending. On the 25th of November 1941, in the Mediterranean, HMS Barham was hit by 3 torpedoes from U-331. Her magazines detonated. A Path News cameraman captured it live. Those images, a 30,000-ton battleship rolling over and blowing apart in 5 minutes, became the most famous of the naval war. 841 crewmen were killed. In parallel to Queen Elizabeth, the Admiralty authorized a second series, the same 15-inch guns, but cheaper, the Revenge class. 5 ships. The internal files put it plainly. The need was, and, I quote, a large number of battleships at moderate cost. At Jutland, on the 31st of May 1916, Vice Admiral David Beatty's fast vanguard met Franz Hipper's, and what Fisher had insisted was impossible for 10 years happened. HMS Indefatigable, a battle cruiser, exploded in 2 minutes. 1,017 dead. 2 survivors. HMS Queen Mary, considered the best gunnery ship in the fleet, exploded 20 minutes later. 1,266 dead. 9 survivors. Hours later, HMS Invincible was broken in 2 and sank in 90 seconds. 1,026 dead. 6 survivors. Beatty, watching the second of his battle cruisers disintegrate, uttered the sentence engraved in every naval history book of the 20th century. Chatfield, there seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today. It wasn't. Poorly protected magazines, anti-flash doors left open to keep up the rate of fire, insufficient deck armor, all of it proved Fisher had been wrong. Speed was not armor. Armor was armor. The Revenges survived into the next war, and on the 14th of October, 1939, barely 6 weeks after it began, the U-47 penetrated Scapa Flow, the Royal Navy's safest base. She found HMS Royal Oak at anchor. 3 torpedoes hit. In 13 minutes, the battleship had disappeared. 833 crewmen died, including Rear Admiral Blagrove. 134 of the dead were cadets under the age of 18. Fisher had built, in parallel to Dreadnought, another generation. The battle cruisers. Same guns, half the armor. The Invincible class, 3 ships commissioned in 1908 and 1909. Invincible seemed right for the first few years. On the 8th of December 1914 at the Falklands, HMS Invincible and HMS Inflexible sank the German armored cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. More than 2,200 German casualties, including Admiral von Spee and his 2 sons. The British battle cruisers had done their job. However, that success created a fatal expectation. The Royal Navy asked for more. Bigger. Beatty called them the Cats. Lion, Princess Royal, Queen Mary, Tiger. With a problem Beatty never admitted publicly, to keep up the rate of fire, his crews left the anti-flash doors between the magazines and the turrets open. 1 extra second of fire per salvo, a second that at Jutland would cost over 3,000 lives. And even after Jutland, Fisher, by then retired, asked the Admiralty for 2 more battle cruisers, HMS Renown and HMS Repulse. Their armor was 6 inches, half that of the ones that had just exploded. Officers called them refit and repair, because every few years they went back into dry dock trying to fix their inadequate armor. They never managed it. On the 10th of December 1941, HMS Repulse was sailing off Malaya with HMS Prince of Wales. No air cover. 88 Japanese aircraft found them. Repulse sank first. 840 crewmen died. And Churchill wrote in his memoirs, "In all the war, I never received a more direct shock." Because the flagship of this philosophy, the biggest, the fastest, the proudest of every British battle cruiser ever built, had been the visible jewel of the Empire for 20 years. Everyone called her the Mighty Hood. August 1918. At the John Brown Yard on the Clyde, the largest warship ever built for the Royal Navy is launched. 860 feet long, 46,600 tons, 8 15-inch guns. 31 knots. HMS Hood. But here comes the irony. Hood had been designed in 1916 to counter German battlecruisers that were never completed. By the time she was launched, the enemy she was built to fight no longer existed, and her deck armor was barely touched, between 3 and 5 inches. The Admiralty's engineers knew it. They recommended rebuilding her in the 30s. The reconstruction was postponed for lack of budget. When it was finally authorized in 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. Hood entered the Second World War exactly as she had been launched 20 years earlier. However, in those 2 decades, Hood was more than a ship. She was the symbol of the British Empire itself. In 1923, she led the famous Empire Cruise, an 11-month voyage around the world. 40 ports, 4 continents. Hundreds of thousands came aboard. The press called her the Mighty Hood. For an entire generation of Britons, Hood was not a ship. She was Britain. And according to Admiralty records, in 1939 she was still the largest warship in the world. Dawn of the 24th of May, 1941. Denmark Strait. Hood and Prince of Wales intercept Bismarck and Prince Eugen. At 5:55 in the morning, the 4 ships open fire. On her 5th salvo, Bismarck hits Hood somewhere in the aft section. The cordite ignited. The main magazine exploded. The archives agree on the following. HMS Hood broke in 2. Her stern sank in less than 3 minutes. Her bow rose vertically and disappeared in under 8 minutes. Of 1,418 crew, 3 survived. In London, Churchill gave one order. 3 words: sink the Bismarck. And the entire home fleet changed course to carry it out. Because Hood was not a ship. She was the symbol of Britain. And Bismarck had sunk her in under 8 minutes. In 1921, the Washington Treaty limited every battleship in the world. No new ship could displace more than 35,000 tons. No gun larger than 16 inches. British engineers faced a nearly impossible geometric problem. The numbers didn't add up. However, the head of the Naval Construction Section proposed a solution without precedent, concentrating every main turret on the bow. 3 triple 16-inch turrets, 0 turrets aft. The ships would not be able to shoot backwards. The sailors gave them a nickname, the cherry trees, because they said they were cut down by Washington. HMS Nelson and HMS Rodney, commissioned in 1927, and they would have 14 years to prove Washington had been wrong. That moment came on the morning of the 27th of May, 1941. 4 days earlier, Hood had gone down. Churchill had given his order, and HMS Rodney opened fire on Bismarck at 8:47 in the morning. According to Admiralty records, HMS Rodney fired 380 rounds of 16-inch that morning, with an estimated 30 to 40 direct hits. The salvo widely credited with disabling Bismarck's forward turrets fell at 8:47. The German forward guns never fired again. And in the final phase, according to the gunnery reports, the range had dropped to 3,000 yards. Less than 3 kilometers. Rodney was firing her 16-inch guns at almost point-blank range. The shock waves were tearing plates off her own deck. It didn't matter. Bismarck was burning from bow to stern. At 10:39, she sank. 1936. A second treaty, the London Naval Treaty, reduced the maximum caliber to 14 inches. With a secret clause, If Japan did not sign before April 1937, the limit would rise to 16 inches. Japan did not sign. However, by then the keels were already laid and the 14-inch guns were already in production. The 5 ships of the King George V class entered the water with a caliber disadvantage against every enemy battleship they would face. Important note, this is not the King George V of 1911 from earlier in this video. This is her grandson. Radar-controlled gunnery, quadruple 14-inch turrets. HMS Prince of Wales was commissioned on the 19th of January 1941, 4 months before the Bismarck chase. When she sailed with Hood, the yard workers were still aboard, still finishing the hydraulic circuits. The crew was undertrained, and even so, during the 8 minutes in which Hood was exploding, Prince of Wales landed 3 hits on Bismarck. One of them punctured a fuel tank. The trail of fuel oil left by that hit would be the reason Bismarck could not escape. On the 27th of May, HMS King George V finished off Bismarck alongside Rodney. According to the archives, she fired 368 rounds of 14-inch, with an estimated 6 to 10 direct hits. However, 6 months later, the class suffered the blow that would define everything. On the 10th of December 1941, HMS Prince of Wales was sailing off Malaya as flagship of Force Z. No air cover. 88 Japanese aircraft attacked. In 2 hours, Prince of Wales was on the seabed. 327 crewmen killed, including Admiral Phillips. According to the battle reports, she became the first battleship in history ever sunk by aircraft in combat while underway on the open sea. 2 years later, the class would reclaim some of that pride. On the 26th of December 1943, in a polar night without moonlight off the North Cape, HMS Duke of York intercepted the German battleship Scharnhorst. Duke of York opened fire at 17,000 meters, guided entirely by radar. Not one human eye saw the enemy during the opening salvos. Within an hour, Scharnhorst was reduced to a burning wreck. The Battle of the North Cape was the last battleship engagement the Royal Navy would ever fight in her history. October 1941. At the John Brown Yard, the same one that had built Hood, the keel is laid for the last British battleship, and her design showed a peculiarity without precedent. Her 8 15-inch guns were going to be recycled. They had been manufactured in 1915 for 2 battle cruisers, HMS Courageous and HMS Glorious. In 1924, both had been converted into aircraft carriers and their turrets stored in Newcastle. In 1941, someone remembered them. The most modern guns on the last British battleship were as old as the engineer's own grandfathers. When she was launched on the 30th of November 1944, Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen, broke the bottle against her hull. She was named HMS Vanguard, and when she was finally commissioned in April of 1946, the war she had been designed for had been over for 8 months. Yamato and Musashi already lay at the bottom of the Pacific. In February of 1947, Vanguard sailed from Portsmouth carrying King George VI, Queen Elizabeth, and Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret bound for South Africa. It was the first time in history that the entire British royal family had left the Isles for 3 months aboard a single ship. And it was the last great ceremonial act of the Royal Navy as an imperial fleet. Princess Elizabeth turned 21 on board on the 21st of April 1947, the day she delivered by radio the famous speech, I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service. And here comes the final irony. According to official Admiralty records, HMS Vanguard was the only completed British battleship never to see combat. A ship designed to fight Yamato, whose only serious firings were ceremonial salvos and royal salutes. On the 4th of June 1960, HMS Vanguard left Portsmouth for the last time, bound for the scrapyard. As she maneuvered through the exit channel, she momentarily ran aground against the Isle of Wight ferry berth. The old sailors smiled. A rumor ran along the docks. She doesn't want to go. She was towed out the following day. And at Faslane, between 1960 and 1962, she was cut apart by torches. Her 15-inch turrets, manufactured in 1915, mounted in 1917, dismounted in 1924, stored until 1941, mounted again in 1946, and sailed for 14 years, were finally melted down for scrap. No British battleship has been launched since 1944. Almost everyone believes aircraft carriers killed the British battleship. Prince of Wales proved it off Malaya. Japanese aircraft sank in 2 hours what Germany had not managed to sink with 15-inch guns. But the Admiralty's archives tell another story. Every battleship you have seen in this video, from Warrior to Vanguard, was born obsolete. Not badly designed. Obsolete in the sense that her enemy was already being drawn up in some office before her keel touched the water. Warrior was overtaken by devastation in 13 years. Dreadnought by her successors in 4. Hood by shells that struck from above. Against a deck her engineers had been trying to reinforce for 20 years. The British battleship was not killed by aircraft carriers. She was killed by her own doctrine. By the stubborn belief, defended by Fisher until the last day, that the largest capital ship in the world would be enough. The Royal Navy built 157 battleships between 1860 and 1946. She lost 13 in combat. She scrapped the rest. And in 1960, when Vanguard left Portsmouth for the last time with her hull scraping against the dock, an entire century closed behind her. But if there is one British war machine that did know how to evolve, one that began with an almost handmade design in 1936 and kept transforming through 9 unbroken years of combat until it was almost unrecognizable from the original, that machine did not sail the sea. It flew over it. It was called the Supermarine Spitfire. And between 1938 and 1948, the Royal Air Force squeezed 24 different variants out of her, each one designed to beat the enemy the previous model could no longer face. From the Mark I that fought the Battle of Britain to the Mark 24 that was still in service in the 50s. That is exactly the video you need to watch next. The complete history of every Spitfire ever built.